Okay, let's get started. So, hi folks, I'm Marilyn, Merritt-Gray, and I am the co-chair of Voices for Sustainable Environments and Communities. And joining me is Kim Reeder, who is our project facilitator. So Voices is a fairly young group. We were established in 2014. We're a not-for-profit New Brunswick community group with a mandate to advocate for the environment by gathering, sharing information, and hosting workshops, raising questions, and working toward solutions. So our climate adaptation work has been made possible through funding from the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund, some money, leverage money from the World Wildlife Fund, and we've worked in collaboration with the Below Watershed Coalition. So within this presentation, what we want to share is a bit on what we've been doing related to climate adaptation, climate change adaptation, and community mobilization. And I use that, we use that language intentionally, the community mobilization focused in our area. Most importantly, though, we will share what some of the key things that we've learned during doing our work. So first off, our region. Our region is situated within the lower Woolastook St. John River area, below Fredericton and Oromocto, and above St. John. And you can see it marked on the map there on your screen. The population in our rural region is approximately about 10,000. And about half of the people, half of those residents are people designated by government as seasonal residents. So the full area of our region is floodplain. And about 21% of that area is designated as rich wetland. The tax base within the region has continued to grow despite experiencing devastating flood events repeatedly over the past 5 years. There are no towns within the region, rather small rural historic communities make up the area. The region has been newly reorganized with a local governance structure under the municipalities of Arcadia and Valley Waters. And Arcadia is in the more northern part of the region, and Valley Waters is in the more the lower part of the region. Okay, next slide. So what have we been doing? The long-term goal of our project has been to build resilience to the impacts of climate hazards. We began this work in 2019 in response to the 2018 devastating freshet. Community mobilization, as we all know, involves trust and relationship building and goes beyond, well beyond priority setting and education. With this in mind, along with the realities of COVID that we've all experienced, our process has been slow. We chose a regional community of interest approach to our project rather than focus on individual distinct communities. And we did that intentionally, acknowledging the rural nature of communities within the sensitive floodplain region. We've been working across and within these communities to achieve our goal to reduce climate hazards. The area has a long history of resource sharing, and people face common challenges and opportunities as I'm calling river people. Our work has been challenged, though, because our region crosses several governance boundaries. For example, we have 2 different regional service commissions, still do within the local governance structure. So 2 different regional service commissions govern the area, as well as the health regions, separate regions within the separate from the regional service commissions, are also divided across the area. The emergency measures structure, the crisis response service, is also organized differently than how our region is, and none of those boundaries for those different service resources are consistent across, which has created, you can well imagine, a challenge in terms of just trying to sort out how things on the ground will operate and priorities and the various people in terms of needing to connect with and work through. So looking at the first thing that we did is within our community of interest was identify the climate change hazards and impacts that were the most concern to the people of the area. We considered everything from frost to wildfire, and the two main concerns were, and as people have already alluded to in other presentations, it's been pretty consistent across presentations, is first the impacts of flooding from extreme freshet and as well as overland flooding. The second was the impacts of increased temperatures and frequency of heat waves. You can see the other areas of priority and concern that people had identified on the slide. But I just want to highlight number 3 with the water quality and water quantity being a particular issue that's growing in terms of concern within our area. And related to that is because we're a rural area that's relying on private wells, private, not public water sources. This water supply to schools, also to nursing homes, seniors facilities, and people's actual private wells have become an increasing concern. And as well as the reoccurrence and persistence of blue-green algae being a reality within our waterways. The item number, the fourth item in terms of that relates to emergency and crisis response service, I want to highlight in that the adjective of meaningful. And by that being, yes, there's concern about in terms of the meaningful, what is that nature of the response, and does it actually match what people are needing on the ground? But overriding all of these priorities has been a concern. What we hear often is, do we have the government support that we need to do the things that in a situation that best fits our situation? People will say, so much is out of our control, so much needs to be done related to critical infrastructure, and there's so little of that we really feel like we have input into. We need government to hold up its end of the bargain. We know, people will say, we know that investments have been made, new culverts have been made, road repairs have been made after washouts, but we really don't feel like we're any more prepared looking to the future. For example, one of the big issues is, while they know that there's been different investments that have been made and with a tagline of climate adaptation, is we still do not have emergency exits that are secured leading into like pre-freshet time when we know that we're most vulnerable. So some of those things are still very front and center and raise questions and concern for us, as well as land use planning and enforcement related to forest and agricultural management, and how building permits are enforced or okayed, and they look still to the enforcement of it looks still to be ineffective with. So that was where we started. So some of the lessons learned that we wanted to share with regions that, particularly with regions that are similar to us, is the first area was the data that we had to work with, and looking at a rural region that isn't, which actually, when you think about New Brunswick, is actually comprises a good lot of our province. Population health data for our community of interest was missing. I mean, there's population health data for large, the health regions, but to break it down to a particular community of interest hasn't been possible. So also recognizing that we have private wells and sewage systems, the condition, what the quality and the quantity of our local aquifers within the our region is also data that's missing. And it's data that we, in terms of long-term planning, thinking about risk level and vulnerability, is something that we need to have to be able to work with. Demographic info also currently omits seasonal resident information. So we can get a snapshot of the demographics generally in terms of age and household size, age of the housing structures, for on and on, but we don't have it for about half of our population, which are seasonal residents. So what we've needed to do is to draw on municipal tax information, look at what is the overall economy and the growth within our area, as well as NB Power data in terms of just looking at households within the region. But in order to put together what is the context upon which to do the planning, is we need to have that to build to that added data to build a meaningful plan. The other thing is predictive inland flood hazard mapping is thank heavens available to us, but we haven't seen it being used by people locally to assist in land use and property decision making. We know we heard that it's been used by insurance companies, but not as much in terms of people making decisions around whether it's real estate and also around some of just the basic planning within our area. And obviously we need that. The other is that we wanted to raise is that one of the things that we see repeatedly and see it as been an issue is government and public discourse remains still very dominated by the rhetoric of why don't people leave or retreat or move from the area. If this is a floodplain, then why don't people move out of the area? And my background is in health and doing research in the woman abuse and domestic violence sphere. And I'd suggest that we need to look at some of the work that has gone on, particularly in the woman abuse and domestic violence area, around what are the narratives and how have we actually worked with community related to this? Because what we've learned in the domestic violence world is that if we dominate the rhetoric around why don't people leave, why don't they move, retreat, they need to do that. If we dominate our messages with that, then what that tends to do is we tend to alienate the very people that we want to reach the most. So we would suggest that more of a harm reduction or a trauma-informed approach to our messaging and our narrative in the way we engage, particularly when we're doing preventive work or working with mobilizing communities, that become more of an approach with our work. And Kim has said to me, well, now what would that look like? And that's one of the things that we've said that's something that I think that we need to talk about that across, our the lot of us that are working in the area, and whether that through the environmental network in terms of having dialogue about that, what would that look like? What are some of the similarities, things we can learn from other fields that have looked at community mobilization into the future? How do we message that to actually engage people in a more constructive way? looking at the rural context, highlighting that we know that climate change policy and initiatives remain still very urban centric. And for us, it's always been an age-old issue in a lot of the health field and the social human resource field of what do we mean by rural? What is our all of New Brunswick for many people is seen as rural, but for us in our work, the issue of when people are on a private well and have private sewage and have private responsibilities related to that, then that seems to be for us a very meaningful definition in terms of rural, because it makes quite a different for a very different reality. Within our community of interest, the 90% of our population is reliant on private well, private water, and private sewage. The other issue that I wanted to raise is the issue of the double-edged sword of what we call invisibility. Rural folks raise regularly how they feel like so much of government policy and programs tend to render us living in more rural areas as invisible, feel ignored. We kind of rail against that and feel like we've been ignored and that we are invisible. At the same time, many of us fiercely protect our privacy, and guard against outside interference. And that reality raises the issue because that challenge and that dual sense of thinking that fits with that is a reality that we need to keep in mind as we actually do rural focused mobilization work. The other thing is that there's just still many myths that are alive and well when people are actually talk about policy and rural populations, particularly the notion that everybody knows everybody within a rural environment. We know very well from our data and our work that actually a lot of people don't know who a lot of the people in the rural area are. Identifying people with greatest need within rural areas can be a real challenge, and it has been a real challenge for us. The myth that rural folks are slow to innovate, we know in terms of with the farming populations, it's clearly not the reality, and so there's a lot of those myths that still consist and still persist. Making those shifts in terms of addressing those myths and our rhetoric, the narratives that we use, calls for a paradigm shift. The way we think about how we do approach and how we understand this, and to be effective, we need to actually make that shift. So moving to thinking about, and I see your notes there, Zahra. When we think about, we've done the adaptation research, thinking about moving into the implementation planning at this point. What we see is two things that we need most is to actually government support that's visible and in the most key areas that actually we identify, particularly those exits being available. The other is that groups like Voices have a key role to play in terms of acting as champions and working to network across sectors. And going back to lessons learned, how important those Facebook community networks and communication groups, those network dialogue groups that are available to people during crisis times, but also dealing with prevention and some of the getting some of the best information out there. We've seen really good success with dealing with the realities of blue-green algae and helping people understand risks as well as what they can do. And building on what's possible with education related to drawing on the resource of volunteer fire departments who seem to have been left out of much of the networks of support with. So thinking about, in terms of just moving to conclusions with, is how important it is to understand and appreciate the realities of local people, in terms of cutting through myths and actually getting people actually engaged in that mobilizing process, and learning from other areas of work that like community health, like community development work, and in terms of women abuse, working within sectors where there's stigmatized populations, of what are some of those lessons that we've learned that we can apply here. And the other key thing is actually how much we need to learn from each other in our work. So just want to say thank you and appreciate the opportunity of participating today. So thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. You're right on schedule. Perfect. I appreciate you guys coming and sharing with your community. I don't know what to, yeah, my brain's going freezing right now. It's the afternoon. I'm going to move on to the next presentation. It's with Kathryn Bakos, and I'm going to screen share for her. So give me a second to get that up. And I think I've got it there. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Just let me know when you want me to go forward.
Yeah,
So,
definitely. Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. It's very great to be here with you all, and a pleasure to have seen all of the presentations that have that we've done so far. So thank you for that. Again, hello, my name is Kathryn Bakos, and I'm Director of Climate Finance and Science at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. I know my colleague Caroline was already here and she had a wonderful presentation, but just as a little recap of who we are at the Intact Center, for those of you unfamiliar, we are an applied research center out of the University of Waterloo. And we help homeowners, communities, businesses, and governments reduce risks associated with climate change and extreme weather events, and that's particularly in relation to flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat. So we're here today to talk about climate change, its impact on the Canadian housing market, and the urgent need for adaptation. Before we jump in, though, we must first understand why adaptation is needed. And I know everyone on this call has a very good understanding of why climate change is needed, but I'd like to do a little review first before we jump into some of the work that the Intact Center has done. So climate change manifests itself as extreme weather, and these events are becoming more severe around the world, as we all know. Global examples from this past year alone were heat waves, wildfires, hurricanes, flooding, mudslides, droughts. These events cause power outages, supply chain impacts, evacuations, socioeconomic implications, and loss of life. And so we must amplify the discussion, which we're doing here today, around adaptation as the impacts of extreme weather are occurring right now. So with that, this is what I'm here to focus on: how climate change is exacerbating extreme weather, what the financial and social costs are associated with these events, and how they're increasing, and more importantly, how well-informed guidelines have already been developed to improve the resiliency of Canadian communities to a changing climate, but they're being deployed too slowly. So this presentation will showcase Canada's urgent need to adapt. Next slide, please. So by way of agenda, we're going to head in the following direction. We're going to discuss how climate change is effectively irreversible and why the impacts of severe weather will continue to increase and be felt across Canada. We're going to discuss the costs of physical climate change, including catastrophic insurable loss claims, the impact of flooding on the residential housing market, and mental health impacts caused by extreme weather. We're then going to turn to guidance available to limit physical climate risk and how these resources can be used to support the newly released National Adaptation Strategy for Canada. And with that, and since we have a lot of ground to cover in less than 20 minutes, I'm going to get right to it. Next slide, please. So as I'm sure you're all familiar with, but according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their report, their climate change report of 2022 impacts adaptation and vulnerability, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, their changing climate report of 2019, Both determine firstly that climate change is real, that it has happened, it is happening, and it will continue to happen. So in other words, it is irreversible. Over the course of the last 100 years, the Earth has warmed by approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius, and it will continue to warm. In places like Canada, we're warming at 2 to 3 times that amount. We can slow down the rate of change, but we cannot reverse it, at least not with the technology that we currently have. So what these reports also determined is that climate change is human-induced. So I always say, for those who will say that climate change has happened in the past, I completely agree with them. It has. But reasons for previous changing climate events, such as the tilting of the Earth's axis, radiation from the sun, volcanic eruptions, and asteroid, cannot explain the changing climate that is occurring right now. So that's only when we look at the impacts of burning of fossil fuels, natural gas.
Oh, coming in hot.
All
Oh.
Whoever's
Oh.
speaking right now, please mute
So that
yourself. I
top
think
one's
you
like
might.
is it a winter boot or
It is.
a
like
warm?
winter boot.
Think we got it.
We think we got it? Well, winter boots are good. The snow's coming, at least here in Ontario, so that's great. So it's only when we look at the impacts of burning of fossil fuels. So natural gas, coal, and oil that when burnt release greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. So I know you're all familiar, but it traps energy, and this causes the manifestation of extreme weather. So given we understand it's the burning of fossil fuels that's driving these more intense storms, then the expression of climate change as extreme weather will only continue to worsen with the further burning of fossil fuels. So the question is, are we going to continue to burn fossil fuels? Next slide, please. So as you can see from the graph on the left, globally, we're emitting greater amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere year over year. So these slight fluctuations or dips that you see on the graph are due to times of photosynthesis, where trees and plants absorb CO2 and release oxygen into the atmosphere. Now, this graph does end in 2020, but what are the future projections of more CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere? Well, according to the International Energy Agency, which is the global authority on all energy use, 80% of the world's energy supply currently comes from a third, oil, coal, natural gas. By 2035, it's estimated that 80% of the world's energy supply will continue to come from a third, oil, coal, and natural gas. Now, obviously, this does not include any breakthrough technologies such as fusion or massive expansion and investment in green technology. In addition, global energy output will actually be 12 to 15% higher, with one key reason being that population rates continue to rise. So hourly, we're adding 8,000 people to this planet. If you subtract births from deaths per year, that's 70 million people. And by 2035, we'll have an additional 1 billion people on this planet. And those people deserve access to clean water, electricity, education, and healthcare, which all drive up emissions. In addition, geopolitical issues such as the war in Ukraine are forcing countries to take from oil reserves and even consider reigniting coal-fired plants to substitute for the loss of energy supplies from countries like Russia. So to provide you with a little bit of context, coal burns at 100% higher carbon intensity per unit of energy than natural gas. Therefore, we're actually going to be putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere with the use of coal. So thus the chart on the left will only continue to increase with the years to come. So if we look at the image on the right, positive feedback loops also contribute to increasing impacts of climate change. So as an example, as temperatures continue to rise, ice and snow cover will continue to melt. Ice and snow cover reflects the sun and its heat away from the Earth's surface. So when ice and snow melt, dark surfaces such as bodies of water will absorb that heat, contributing to rising temperatures, which then melts more ice and snow, which then contributes to more rising temperatures. So climate change is driving climate change, and this is happening at such a fast rate that there is no new normal. Even if we continue to put efforts towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which we need to do, we need to limit the worsening impacts of climate change in the future. But these effects will continue to increase the manifestation of climate change as extreme weather, as well as the costs associated with those impacts. So the question is now, what are the costs of climate change and extreme weather? Next slide, please. So this image here displays the Oh, sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. So this image here displays the annual catastrophic insurable losses for Canada. So a CAT loss is any event, such as a flood, fire, hailstorm, etc., that triggers $25 million or more of insurable losses. So if you can see on the graph, between 1983 to 2008, which is just outside of the blue boxed region, losses ranged from $250 to $450 million for extreme weather events per year. As you can see from 2009 onward, which is within the blue boxed region, there is a discernible upward trend in losses. So losses now average $1.96 billion a year, with 12 out of the 13 of the last years being above $1 billion. So the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021, losses were over $2 billion for each year. A recent article from the Insurance Bureau of Canada stated that $2 billion in insurable losses is the new normal for catastrophic losses. Now, these losses are represented here. They are corrected for inflation as of 2021 and per capita wealth accumulation. So we are looking at a comparison of apples to apples year over year. So it's also important to note that these are insurable losses. Multiply this graph by 3 to 4 times, and you'll get uninsurable losses that individuals and governments are paying out of pocket for. For governments specifically, that's money coming out of budgets for hospitals, schools, infrastructure development. And with COVID-19, there's no excess money for spending. So we must understand the socioeconomic impacts that are happening because of climate change. Now, if we take the Fort McMurray wildfire out of this graph, as it acts as almost an outlier in this case, flooding is greater than 50% of all losses throughout Canada. These losses are mostly coming from flooding manifesting itself as flooded basements. Now, remember, we're talking about insurable losses here. Now, across Canada, insurance premiums are drastically increasing. Cap limits are decreasing to $10,000 to $20,000, and yet a flooded basement costs on average $43,000. If your flooded basement happens on a Monday, it must be cleared out by the Wednesday, because that flood was probably caused by sewer backup or sewer water, which would make the house uninhabitable. But if your cap limits are only $10,000 to $20,000, a homeowner could be on the line for $33,000 within 2 days. And yet, prior to COVID-19, 50% of Canadians were living paycheck to paycheck. And we now know that number has grown because of things like COVID and monetary policy rate hikes. So we're not just talking about the financial impacts to insurance. We're talking about the uninsurability and the instability of the Canadian housing market. Next slide, please. So this is where the Intact Centre report, Treading Water, Impact of Catastrophic Flooding on Canada's Housing Market, really comes into play. So the purpose of this report was to determine if 1 to 2 community level flood events over a 10-year period impacted average sold price of a house, number of homes on the market, and number of days on the market, and mortgage arrears and deferrals. So the slide really highlights results quite well. In short, homes located in flooded communities saw an 8.2% reduction in sold price, 44.3% less homes were listed on the market in flooded communities, and when homes were listed on the market, they stayed there 19.8% longer. Now, what about communities that have experienced more than 1 to 2 flood events over a 10-year period? Well, to answer this question, and quite relevant for our audience today, we utilized Fredericton, New Brunswick as a candidate city. So Fredericton experienced major flood events every year between 2008 to 2018, with a single exception of 2016. So these floods varied in impact between communities within the city due to varying combinations of heavy precipitation, ice jams, snowmelt, heavy snowfall, and late spring thaw. So losses due to flooding ranged from $1.4 to $25 million in insurable claims. And again, remember, multiply that amount by 3 to 4 times, and you'll get uninsurable losses, with the average losses, insurable losses, being $13.4 million per year. Now, that was between 2008 to 2018. In April of 2019, Fredericton experienced another catastrophic flood event. And so our team investigated, with the most notable outcome of repeated flooding across communities being that there is a large-scale incorporation of flood risk into housing price, independent of a community being flooded in a given year. So, in other words, whether or not your home has been flooded in a city like Fredericton, your house will experience the flood discount value, meaning you're losing value on your home, whether you've been flooded out or not. Next slide, please. So up until this point, we've been talking about the financial costs, but what are the social costs of climate change? Well, in 2017, our team conducted interviews with households that experienced basement flooding in Burlington, Ontario, which in August of 2014 experienced an atypical and severe precipitation event, resulting in 3,500 homes being flooded out. So these microburst storms are becoming more and more frequent, which is something that cities across Canada should be paying attention to. So one of the fundamental questions that we documented was on a scale of 0 to 5, 5 being the worst. We asked people to grade how much stress they feel during precipitation events. Now remember, this study was conducted 3 years after the flood event had occurred, and yet, as you can see from the graph here, flooded household members experience significantly higher worry and stress every time precipitation events occur. When we did this study 3 years after, people were still, every time it rained, they were going into their basements 3 times a night to make sure it wasn't flooded out. So it's a really horrible way to live. Additionally, flooded household members were forced to take days off of work, on average 7 days. So lost time from work, psychosocial stressors associated with medication uptake. These are all claims that go through life and health insurers and not the property and casualty, which I had shown you earlier on. So what we determined was that climate change does not just have financial, but mental health costs as well, meaning that a major flood event could stress an already stressed healthcare system. Next slide, please. So in addition to understanding how physical climate risk will evolve, municipalities need to ensure they're well acquainted with and have appropriate understanding of the guidelines already developed to mitigate extreme weather risk. So it's important to understand how physical risk will manifest, as we've discussed, but as well as how it can be limited. So our team at the Intact Centre has worked with groups like the Standards Council of Canada, the Canadian Standards Association, and generally speaking, for any of the reports that you see here, we bring together 60 to 80 subject matter experts on average from across the country with relevant expertise to develop practical, meaningful, and cost-effective ways to adapt to the physical risk of climate change. So on this slide, I've provided guidelines to reduce the risk of flooding at the level of the home, community, new and existing community design, commercial real estate, coastal communities, and the importance of retaining and restoring natural infrastructure, such as wetlands, grasslands, and forested areas to attenuate the effects of flooding. In regards to wildfire, the Intact Centre has worked with Fire Smart Canada to develop wildfire protection measures for the level of the home, which is the image in the top right-hand corner of your screen. In the bottom right-hand corner, the Intact Centre has investigated the impact of extreme heat and its impacts on infrastructure and services, natural systems, the economy, and community health, which my colleague Carolyn Metz did an amazing job discussing with you all earlier today. So as a review, though, the report sets out actions that individuals, building owners, managers, and communities can take to reduce risks associated with extreme heat. Those are the non-structural, so individual behavioral solutions, natural infrastructure solutions, retaining, restoring, or rebuilding natural infrastructure, and built infrastructure solutions such as passive and active cooling buildings. Now, the direction outlined in all of these reports can be used by municipalities to understand how risk can be mitigated at the community level while ensuring information is distributed to homeowners to reduce risks. So as an example, in the report in the top left-hand corner of your screen for flood and home, municipalities can distribute home flood protection information to residents in property tax mail-out notices, which has been done in towns and counties across Canada. So in addition to understanding how physical climate risk will evolve, municipalities must complement that knowledge by utilizing these guidelines to support decision-making and deploy information in ways to reduce risks. Next slide, please. Finally, Canada's National Adaptation Strategy was released last month, which sets long-term transformational goals as well as long-term or medium-term objectives to ensure that we have direction for climate change resilience in the country. So in order to achieve the longer-term goals and objectives, urgent action is required right now. So as you can see from the list on the right-hand side of your screen, goals include understanding disaster risk, preventing and reducing disaster risk activities, protecting people from health risks, halting and reversing biodiversity loss, infrastructure decision-making, and climate-exposed businesses should include adaptation in decision-making. So these objectives and targets can directly be met by utilizing the guidance provided in the Intact Center reports that I highlighted on the previous slide. Building resilience to the impacts of climate change is a collective effort. Everyone in Canada is part of the solution, and to make things easier and more hopeful, we already have guidance on what we can do to achieve these targets. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we now understand that climate change is effectively irreversible and the cost will continue to increase. Canada has taken great strides to develop its national adaptation strategy, which sets out objectives and targets to build more resilient communities across Canada. I believe we all understand that adaptation is urgently required now, and where there may have been very little before, there is hope that we as a collective can reach these goals by implementing already available guidance to limit physical climate risk. The guidance just needs to be actioned, and it needs to be actioned now. So I'm going to end my presentation here, but thank you so much for your time, and I welcome any questions. I did see a few coming in, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathryn. And maybe we'll spotlight Marilyn and Kim as well for the question period. And then Zomi, I'll let you take over and pose the questions to all of our speakers.
Sure. We have, oh, and I'll spotlight Marilyn. Okay, so the first question is, we've had discussions in the past about the focus here in New Brunswick on greenhouse gas emission reduction. This data shows that we need to focus our climate adaptation planning more on flood mitigation. Does Intact have these numbers broken down by province?
Sorry, just to clarify, which numbers? Oh, the loss numbers?
I'm not sure, actually. That's a good question. The person who
was
wrote that,
actually
are you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, it's Ben Whalen speaking with the Bacchus watershed. I was actually speaking with the loss numbers. Again, we focus here a lot on our climate change adaptation plan and focuses a lot on greenhouse gas emissions and that kind of thing. And I've been trying to push for more direct investment in flood mitigation on climate change adaptation as well. And I want to know, does Intact have numbers? Any of the numbers really that Kathryn you provided in your presentation would be great if they were broken down by province. Even you used Fredericton as an example, and that's great. But before that slide, you had numbers of loss, I think, as well.
Yes, and sorry, you're cutting out just a little bit as you're speaking, so I'm going to try to piece together what you said. So it's actually not Intact. Intact is just one insurer. So Intact actually doesn't provide that data. It's actually from CAT-IQ and the Insurance Bureau of Canada. So if you actually, and I'd be happy to follow up with an email afterwards, but the Insurance Bureau of Canada actually does a really great job breaking down on an annual basis where losses occurred and how much those losses can be allocated. I don't actually know if they do it on province, but they definitely do it based on event. But I would be happy to follow up on that information. And just to your other point, I completely agree with you. I'd say about 80% of the conversation, this is across governments, even at the municipal level, provincial and federal, but globally as well. We are focused so much on mitigating greenhouse gases, which, and again, I want to highlight, is extremely important. But I think people forget that there are multiple parts to the climate change equation. So mitigating greenhouse gases is one, carbon capture and sequestration is another, and adapting to the effects of climate change. So this is, of full equation of climate change, and the media has to play with that as well, or plays in that field, that we focus so much on mitigating greenhouse gases. Where I am hopeful, I think these events over the last year or few years have really shown the world that we need to be more resilient, especially here in Canada, because of how we have such a large landmass. We have multiple coasts, we have Great Lakes, we have multiple risks at multiple levels. We have vulnerable communities, and adaptation is a really important part of that. But I do notice even in the private sector, this conversation is just now starting to shift, where so much focus was on mitigating greenhouse gases. It's now turning to adaptation or resilience, which is really nice to see as well.
Great, thanks, Kathryn.
Awesome. So the next couple questions are in French. So if you need the interpretation for that, please make sure that you are listening to the English channel. Qu'en est-il des résultats scolaires?
What about school outcomes for children who are affected and family violence, domestic violence? What about school marks, school outcomes for the children who are affected, and how does it relate to domestic violence? I don't know if the person who wrote that question, Serene Turcotte, maybe we need to offer a little bit of context. Victims of flooding. Okay, now that makes more sense.
Sorry, I just missed the first part of that.
Désolé,
René, serait-il possible de...
René, pourrais-tu René, could you rephrase that question?
Did we study the effect of flooding on scholar results for children, and also on family violence as it increases?
Donc, si vous avez...
So, do you have experience with how floods and natural disasters could have an impact on domestic violence?
So I don't know if that's geared towards me or
Est-ce que c'est pour
Marilyn.
moi? Est-ce que c'est pour
I think anybody could take it.
Probably Marilyn, you have a bit of background in that.
Yeah, in terms of though, for the focus of, we didn't look at that directly within our area. I mean, there's information though out there in terms of that yeah, communities that deal with major trauma, like a disaster and repeat crisis that put families in crisis, family violence, and kids, children and living in traumatic, living through traumatic circumstance. It's real.
And it's interesting there. It's
Yeah.
interesting there
Go
too,
ahead.
because one of the things I think we found in the area during the flooding is that, survival kits may not include what you expect them to. And, so governments who are used to being able to give out food vouchers also have to think about smokes and beer and things that keep some people going and keep some people's calm from taking it out on their families. Like a survival kit is a different thing for different people. And we really have to be aware of what that is.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll just maybe speak a little bit more from a global perspective, and not just from a flooding perspective. As extreme weather events continue to happen across the world, what we're going to notice, and there's examples of this already happening, and it has been happening, as these extreme weather events happen, we're going to have climate refugees, and we're going to have mass immigration from regions who are suffering from drought, flooding, and these people. So you're gonna have mass migration into countries that may not want them, that may not have very welcoming immigration policy. So places like Canada, we need to start looking at our immigration policies. We also need to look at infrastructure and how we're developing. Sprawl is not the way. We need to build up. We need to have more access to more affordable housing. And with these migrants, they're going to be exposed to violence along the way if they do not have places to live. Camps that will take in immigrants. There is great amount of violence to children and to women. And then when they're here, there is violence there too. So we're going to see these events being triggering and triggering violent conflict and conflict within larger regions and within households as well.
Yeah, which I just wanted to add to, speaks to the issue of whose needs get, prioritized, where do resources get, because there's often people within any community that are more visible than others. And the question's a really good one, because it's so often, it's those people that are hardest to reach that actually need the resources the most. So paying really attention to that as we do, do mitigation, adaptation work, sorting through.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So the last question in French again. Existe-t-il un outil?
Is there a tool in New Brunswick that would allow us to estimate the cost for a city or a community per inhabitant related to a natural disaster?
That's a great question. I don't know offhand per person. Again, I would have people turn to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the catastrophic, it's called CAT IQ. They summate these losses and are able to calculate the impact on a per individual basis. I don't have that information. I don't know if Kim or Marilyn have access to any of that. I would be happy to look into that and follow up with you under separate cover, but I don't have access to that right now.
I would just say it's a really important question. I know when we began doing our work, part of it, and something that's not talked a lot about, is how do these particularly the repeat disasters actually affect property value, so tax base for a community or an area. So if that tax base is then affected, then that affects the services that area is able to deliver to the people that are living there. And that you can kind of extrapolate from tax information from regional service commissions, but it's not made very visible. And of course, there's all the service, the mobilization of emergency measures, disaster relief, and then the programs available to people who've lost property and had damage and all of that. But that whole area of how does it affect a community's or a city's tax base? So what that resource is that they're able to actually translate into services for the population that's left there, still living there, is an important piece. And it's my hunch is that it's retrievable, but you have to kind of do the logistic dynamics with which you Intac has had great success doing. So.
Yeah, and thank you. And just to add on to what Marilyn was saying as well, and so again, we have those larger catastrophic losses, the understanding that if you multiply that graph that I showed by 3 to 4 times, that's uninsurable losses. And then looking at the research that we've done, and just to give everyone an understanding of how long that took. So that housing report that we did, it was the first quantitative analysis in Canada. Everyone has done, or many people, many organizations have done scenario analysis, but this was actually the first quantitative analysis to look at what actually happened in Canada and use real data. It took our team 2.5 years to get that information. You had provincial and national associations who did not want to provide the information. And so we had to go basically door to door, in the sense of we had to work with real estate agents across Canada to be able to get what homes were sold for, individual homes were sold for, how long they stayed on the market, and to get all of that data. We had to work with financial institutions across Canada who didn't want to provide the information. When we finally received the information, it had to be anonymized. The organization that we worked with had to be anonymized. It is not easy to get this information. It is extremely difficult. It takes a very long time. And that's why it hasn't been done yet, because it takes a very long time. I want to add one more point, which doesn't have to do necessarily with the question, but it triggered something that when Marilyn was speaking, we also have to think about the way that we calculate economic growth. And when we look at GDP, and GDP is a very poor indicator when you're talking about climate change, because we do not include negative externalities into something like GDP. It's a very poor indicator of growth. And just like what Marilyn said, you're putting emergency services, you're putting people to work. So actually, when a massive event happens, an extreme weather event happens, the sad thing is it actually counts as a positive to GDP, because you're putting more people to work, you're putting construction workers to work because you're building and things like that. So we need to start incorporating negative externalities. So when it's an event that could have been avoided had adaptation occurred, there are some things that cannot be adapted against, or there will still be some form of an impact. But for the things that there can be adaptation, we actually need to start counting that as a negative to GDP, even though we're putting people to work and things like that. So there needs to be conversations around that as well.
Thank you very much for all.